Teaching doesn't have to be complicated to be effective, but these days it's getting tougher and tougher to get kids engaged in our lessons and talking with each other. So in today's video, I've got some simple teaching strategies to help increase engagement. If you're new here, I'm Rachel Vincent and I love sharing ways to help teachers simplify their classrooms and their teaching. This first technique is probably one of my favorites to use because it's real easy to do kind of on the fly. So if you're like, oh, they're just not really engaging in what I'm teaching right now, let me pull this out. And that's think, pair, share. So you just give students time to think about their answer. I try to use this strategy with more complex things. Definitely it is good with like reading comprehension, things where they have to like dig a little deeper, give reasons why, and not just like a simple recalling type of answer. So you give students time to think about the answer on their own, and then they pair up and talk with each other about their answers. And then once they've had time to do that, then you have them share with the class. So it takes a couple steps before people are sharing out answers. And here's why I love this strategy. One, it includes that think time so students are having to do some of the work on their own. There are so many kids that will just let others do all the thinking in our classes that they're not doing that themselves. So of course, we don't really know if they're doing the thinking unless you're having them like if they're solving a math problem themselves and then getting together. But it gets them thinking about that questions. And then when they partner up to discuss what their response is, it helps those students who maybe struggle with the concept to be able to kind of talk with someone who can help them through it. Now, as far as partnering them up, I like to partner students based on ability. I don't ever want my highest student and my lowest student to be partnered because that is too much of a gap and it would not lead to success because the higher student would tend to do all the work and all the thinking, not letting that lower student be able to do any of it, or both of them get frustrated because the higher student is doing all the work and the lower student isn't able to get to that answer fast enough. So I don't like doing things like that. So what I do is I will list my students from highest to lowest as far as academic ability. And I have different lists for reading and math. I list them and then I split the list in half. And so if my highest is up here, my lowest, I'm going to split in half. That way, sort of my middle of the road kid is lined up with my highest kid. And then another middle of the road kid is with the lowest kid. So the gap between their abilities is not so far apart that there's this frustration level or one person doing all the work. So this is definitely one of those techniques where you can do it on the fly or you can plan for it. And the easiest way I find to be able to plan for things like this is to include it in my slideshow. I have little templates that I include into my slideshow that I can put into any slideshow that I'm using. So even though I'm using like HMH into reading slides, I can add in my own slides into it as well, just to add that extra component of collaboration. It's great for multi-step math problems, those more complex word problems that takes time to work through so that they partner with somebody to either finish it or check their work and then share it with how we answered the problem. It's really good for questions that have multiple correct answers so that students can see different ways of getting to that. The next technique is one that's been around forever, and it is a simple exit ticket. Now, depending on how you do these will depend on if you need to plan for them in advance. You can easily come up with it on the fly, give everybody a sticky note. It could be as simple as what is something you learned today, just to kind of gauge where students are. But I feel the best ones are the planned ones because you can target a specific skill. Exit tickets should be quick and easy. So it should be 1 or 2 questions and not a whole bunch going on there. I really like to use these in math when it's one of those units where it's like we have a different skill a day. That happens a lot in our geometry unit where we teach about types of angles, then we're teaching about the types of lines, and it just kind of goes kind of quickly. I like to use exit tickets in there just to kind of get an idea of where students are since I know we're moving on to something else the next day. It lets me know how much review I need to do before the next lesson, or if I need to pull students to reteach, do I need to assign them extra practice, different things like that. It just kind of gives me a quick assessment of where they're at with that certain skill. The Jigsaw method is another technique that I like to use. Full transparency, social studies is not a tested subject in 4th grade for South Carolina, so it tends to often get the back burner. But I love history and I love our history standards that we teach in 4th grade, and so I enjoy teaching it, therefore I try to make it fun and engaging for students. So one of the things we decided several years ago in order to make sure that we were teaching social studies was to heavily integrate it into ELA. So most of our social studies is reading and reading comprehension, where we're teaching those reading skills through history passages. So the Jigsaw method works wonderfully. We typically teach social studies at the end of the day. Brains are tired, so we need something that's a little more interactive for students to stay engaged with the content. So one of the ways I do that is I take our reading passage. Let's say we're doing the causes of the revolution, and so I might give a group of students the Sugar Act, and the next one gets the Intolerable Acts, the next one gets the Tea Act, and so they all learn about the different causes, the different acts that led to the Revolutionary War. And so they read, they answer the questions just on that, and then they become the expert and have to teach the class what they learned about their section. Now, obviously, this is one of those things where you want to make sure that you have balanced groups as far as your high readers and low readers. It's one of those things you want to make sure that you are supporting the students who need it, kind of checking in with them. It's not one of those like give it and let it go, but it does make getting through some of the content a little bit quicker instead of having to teach each topic separately. You can get through it quicker. The students only have to really focus on one, so they feel like they're not learning as much, when in reality, you're just going to be sharing it all and still talking about it all. One of the ways I like to sort of wrap up the lesson that we do a Jigsaw strategy with is to do a 3-2-1 reflection at the end of that. That is where students will write 3 things they have learned, 2 things they have questions about, and 1 thing that they really was like their aha, wow, this was such a cool thing to learn. This is what I loved about this lesson. And so it kind of holds them accountability. And there are 3 things they learned. Only one of their sentences can be about the passage they read, the section they read. The other 2 have to be from the other ones. Of course, I tell them that before we start doing the whole process. That way that they're paying attention to when other students are sharing about their topic. The 3-2-1 is also really good for if you're doing a science experiment, things like that, where it's more hands-on and you want to make sure that they're not just being silly or doing the activity, they're actually learning the content that goes behind it. So that's a great. These next 2 aren't really things to do as far as a technique to engage learners, but there are strategies that help keep students engaged in any lesson. The first one is nonverbal cues, having ways to communicate with students and have them communicate with you without speaking, so that it doesn't, I notice the older I get, the more I can forget my train of thought while I'm in the middle of teaching. So if a kid asks me something random, I sometimes forget what I was talking about. Of course, my kids are like, you were saying this, but having nonverbal cues kind of helps with that. So instead of having a way for students to ask to go to the bathroom without being the kid that you're like, oh, they got the answer, and then they're asked to go to the bathroom. I just do a simple R for a restroom. I've seen all over line where teachers have like a 1, 2, or 3 if they need a pencil, a tissue, whatever the case may be. But just having a way that distinguishes those sort of, I just need something extra from I know the answer, so that you know which kids you can call on to answer the question versus the I gotta go to the bathroom question. Another real easy way to get all kids listening, even for you just as the teacher checking in to make sure they're understanding what you're saying, is I talk to my kids all the time about when I am saying something and they just kind of stare at me. I know you know the look where you're talking, there's no response from the class, and you're like, are you even listening to me? And so they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, so one of the ways we show the speaker that we're listening is we nod our head when we understand something. So if like I am talking to you and you're like, okay, I got that, I get it. Just do a little head nod and it lets me know, okay, we're good. I can keep going. I don't have to keep repeating myself. So I actually have that conversation with my students because I don't know why they don't do that. I don't know if it's a lost skill, but I've had to do it more this year than any other year. And even things like where you do like your thumb and your pinky and do like the I agree. If another student is sharing, like I agree with them, having those sort of accountable talk stems where I agree, however, I think this, or I disagree, I think this is actually giving those students the words of how to communicate and sort of engage in our lessons. I even do, I guess those aren't nonverbal. We do a lot of sort of test prep questions at the end. Well, sometimes at the beginning too, but usually at the end of our lessons, especially in math, just because they're always worded differently. And so we like to expose our students to them. So a lot of times I will have them do the A, B, C, or D that go with the answer choices in sign language. So I have them think about it and hold it it, and then they'll show their answer. So one, it's not just a bunch of shouting out, and two, I get to see everybody's answers, and it's just a real easy way to add that to your lesson to keep them engaged. Another way is the simple way of how you structure your lesson. And even probably when I taught third, definitely in fifth, that doing centers is rather difficult. There's several reasons why it's difficult. I think one being like having kids rotate around the room. They're larger. We tend to have larger class sizes. There's just not the space that many of the primary grades might have in order to do that. Two is behavior. Knowing what kids are doing in those centers when you're not around is hard to manage for any grade level, I think, but especially in the older grades. A lot of times the learning gaps between your higher and lower kids are bigger. It's just difficult to find centers that will work for all your students. And so I don't do centers. I do mostly a sort of catch and release model. I do the lesson, we do some examples together, and then they're off working on their own. In math, it's kind of like a catch release, where it's like, I teach the skill, we do some together, they try some on their own, we come back, do some more before I finally send them on their way. Just because math, I feel there's more space for finding errors and addressing them sort of in the moment than maybe reading comprehension. So for our reading, we do a must do, may do. I teach the lesson, and then they have a list of things that they are required to do, and then they have their may do. The must do tends to be like whatever skill we're working on that day. They do it with their book they're reading. It a lot of times is working on their writing. It's things like doing read theory and IXL and those different, making sure they're getting that daily practice. And then the must do is often reading, listening to reading through Epic, practicing cursive, book shopping, like those kinds of things that when they're done with their must do list, they can go into their may do. For math, like I said, it's a lot of that catch and release a couple of times before I send them off. And by the time I send them off, there's not really a whole lot of that they need to work through, kind of like reading is. So usually it's completing their independent practice, and then they just do Dreambox, which is the program our school uses for math. With math, I will have them, when they finish their independent practice, they bring it to me or I go to them and I check it, because math is one of those things that want to give them immediate feedback. And so I will look at their work. I will just circle the problem that they got wrong and not tell them how to fix it. And I will have them go back and try and figure it out on their own. Sometimes kids rush through it. Sometimes I think them learning from their own mistake is more helpful than me pointing it out. And so they go back and fix it on their own. After they've checked their work, if they still have it wrong, that's when I will stop and walk them through the problem or kind of help them find their mistake to help them work through the problem. If you're looking for even more ways to engage your students, especially at the beginning where you're trying to catch their attention, and at the end where you're trying to summarize and wrap up, check out the video that's on your screen now.